When I first started making plates to be hung on the wall as opposed to plates to eat off on the table, I started very small, 8-inch, and then I expanded to about 27-inch. And I was interested in using this as a format, of course, for painting and using my landscape ideas. And when I worked on the wall plate that was flat, that was okay, but when I started looking at it when it was finished and hanging on the wall, I realized that there was this problem of this round static foot rim on the back, and I wanted to be able to view something more interesting from the side of the plate. So that was where I decided that I would have to turn it into more of a three-dimensional form. How was I going to do this? And I came up with the idea of rolling out a slab and supporting it with a round coil, which had a round piece of metal rod in it, and then laying that whole form into a foam mold, which I made out of scrap foam rubber. In terms of a day's work, it's sometimes important to get all the slabs and the circle of the plate and the wire rolled out a day ahead of time, so things have a little bit of chance to form up. Because if you put that slab with the rod in the mold when it's a little too wet, it sort of, no matter how much padding, sinks down too far. And then you're left with this very deep plate that might actually end up coming off the wall too much. So you have to think about these sort of things. So you have to have some rigidity in that slab. Also, when you start cutting it and piercing it, it'll start sinking back down in, with or without a prop. So there's all those technical things you have to think about. So it's good to have the slabs somewhat firm, but of course not too dry that you can't kind of stretch them out. After the plate is set up somewhat, I have some slabs rolled out that I cut shapes out of, which relate to my sketches, hopefully. And I try to fit them in the pierced areas that I've sort of pulled up, and you can see that on the plate. And I have to pinch these into place. Sometimes I have to support them again, or stop and let that set up. So I move from one section of the plate to the other. I'm also thinking at this point of the fairly larger shape that's going to extend beyond the circle or the oval, initial oval of the slab. Sometimes the smaller pieces are more plastic than the larger pieces and are freer. And you work on a larger piece and then it becomes more, it tightens up just because you're afraid maybe something's going to happen to it. It's going to fall in, or you're going to make the wrong move or whatever. With the small one, you just take this carefree attitude. It's sort of like working with, and I've done this in a number of pieces in order to get new ideas. I'll take the leftover parts for, not necessarily a plate, but maybe a vessel, and I'll start playing around with them. I mean, just sitting around, they're going to get hard anyway. And I'll start playing around, and I'll get a new idea for a shape. And sometimes that little practice or that little fussing around, some plasticity things happen that you don't get when you're trying to work on a larger piece. When I'm looking at referring to the sketch, I guess, after I start laying in the slabs on the plate, and I see certain things happening that aren't in the sketch, I have to go with that. I have to adjust that, because I can't really, the sketch is just a kind of a rough guideline. For my way of working, I have to have that openness in the sketch, because things change if I want to keep the plasticity. If something's happening on the plate and not in the drawing, I have to go with that. Otherwise, it'll tighten up, and I think I lose all the fluidity. When I'm thinking about the plasticity of the clay and the freshness of either large pieces or small pieces, I'm thinking also about making the rim for the plate. And I found that the rim is more plastic if I throw it, because I'm using more water and I can stretch it further when it dries because it's more saturated, as opposed to a slab, which tends to tighten up right away. Also, sometimes the rim has this sort of stretched hand look from being thrown. And those sort of marks can be pushed into the slab plate and look like maybe even pushing slip into them. They have that mark of the finger or the hand. The direction of where this rim goes, and that's why I'm always cutting a form and placing it and then taking it away again, and sometimes using a template or a piece of paper to check this out to see if it's going to fit, is that I want some transition between the large sort of bulbous wave form that's coming out and the rim. I don't want it just sticking out there. It has to feed around the side of the plate and maybe even onto the back. The other thing about the day is once you get building and you have to stop, you have to go off to the garden or go in to cook, you have to think about that. And this issue comes up later when I'm painting on things. Sometimes not too much on big pieces, but maybe medium-sized pieces, or maybe it's a good practice for all, is you allot a certain amount of time to work on a piece. You can do this, well, when I was teaching, what I would do, and if I had a meeting and I knew I had maybe 4 hours before this, or 3 hours, this was good, because I could go in, especially when the light is good in the morning or in the afternoon. I don't really like to use slips and paint it in the evening time because the light changes in the studio. So I prefer to do it, it's like a painter, I suppose, approaches their work. I like to do it during the daytime, preferably on not so dark, gloomy day. Anyhow, I go in there with this 4 hours in mind and get going, and then I'd be forced to stop. I mean, even if I didn't want to, because I'm always saying, and some people see in my demonstrations, oh, well, I'm going to quit with this now, I better quit. And then I go back and do one more thing. Well, that one more thing could just blow it. After I've finished painting the surface, and sometimes I wait a little bit, because after I finish painting the surface, sometimes I go back and draw into it when the slip is a little bit dry. And that sets up, then I have to, well, that could take overnight, it depends on the weather. I have to start figuring out how to support it. It's sort of critical because you don't want all the weight in one spot, and I've over the years collected from upholstery stores scrap foam for building the mold, as you could see, and also for parts to support this plate. I mean, they're just in bags. I use it a lot in other work also. Sometimes it's too high and then I have to take it down, so I go through a little bit of indecision and decision to try to get it the right height. The reason I switched to that foam board was I used to use a heavy wood board, but weight is a real thing. If the plate is heavy, everything has to be light in order to flip it over. And also the weight of where the heavy part is of the plate is better if it's at the back end when you flip it over. It sort of helps it flip. But I have to continue the front to the back by thinking about how these shapes are going to relate. Once the plate is flipped over, you'll see that the wire rod that was in the back on the coil has to be cut out first of all. And then I usually use a little extra clay there so that when I do attach a slab, I can use some of that clay on the back and it's easier to attach. But I also usually put a board on the top or the back of the plate just to see, you know, where the wall is going to hit the lower part of the plate, so I can get a feeling of how high the rim will have to be to go to the wall. Also, part of the wave shape needs more volume. I can already see that I could see that actually when it was right side up, that I would have to build part of it back. And in that case, and that's what I like to do, I don't want just a rim. That would get back to the rim on a trim plate. The point is to have some of the three-dimensional quality go back to the wall. People ask me why I refer to this large wall piece as a plate. And I guess actually it's the old hang-up of the potter. I started with the plate, so I keep with that dialogue or that lingo about a plate. But what it really is it's a three-dimensional sculpture. But in a sense, this does have some historical background because the Italians and a number of other countries early on did these plates that were basically flat, but they were paintings. They were straight off paintings. They were just like a painting in oil paint, but they were in, ceramic for the wall, and they were round, and they were never meant to eat off of. And they weren't really a plate. They were a painting. So in a sense, in the three-dimensional reference, my plate has just moved from that image or the idea of a plate into this three-dimensional, which has become more of a wall sculpture. I guess it's just a definition that I'm trying to expand or obliterate. I've been getting into drawing some sort of line to sort of not copy or outline a shape, but to integrate the three-dimensional shape with the flat piece. So I put that line in there with two purposes in mind, maybe putting another color in that line to bring color from the three-dimensional part into the flat part. Some of the black into the green, or some of the orangey red into the green, whatever. The piece is finished in the raw form and dried, and I put the whatever vitreous on gobe or brushed on top, whatever I'm doing. I have to biscuit. I wanted to actually make this whole procedure, especially in big pieces, a once-fired thing, but then when I really saw how I could connect some of the color, say in the bright vitreous envelope areas to the dark areas by rubbing this color into the cracks or the texture, you can't do that on a raw piece. The transition from one value to the next is really important. It's just like in painting. And the complicated thing, I think, with ceramics as opposed to painting, on the canvas, and the fact you have to fire it and everything, is that you are doing this layering with this time lapse in between. So you have to be one step ahead of yourself, in a sense. You're laying down the groundwork of the turquoise, the white. In the case of the plate that you're seeing, I'm using this white, on one plate, this white paper clay, which is very textural. And I think about that because I know certain dark vitreous engobes I can rub into that to make it look really rough and bring out the texture. If I was using white slip, I might think of putting a white glaze on it and putting sort of a yellow over top, or rubbing something into it. So there are two different things I have to think about ahead of time before I actually put the slip on. My forms might come from one type of landscape, either water or rocks or mountains in a certain specific place. The color inspiration doesn't necessarily always come from that same place or that same light conditions, the same time of day. Even season of year, I think of the summer, the bright light, how light sometimes brings out sunlight, especially orange or bright colors I see in the water. When the water's rough and the waves are coming up, it's not just white. Or it may be my exaggerated perception of this. And it's sort of like the time of day influencing Monet's haystacks. I mean, he did maybe 3 or 4 paintings of haystacks, but they're all different times of day. And the color in his mind changed. And that's sort of what happens in mine.